It was at the height of my first year of stardom. Okay, Kotter stardom. So I hadn't done anything else that people knew.
Every so often a show comes along that looks, on paper, like the least interesting pitch in the room. A sitcom about a teacher going back to his own old high school, and somehow turns into a cultural fixture that outlives its own network run. That's exactly what happened with Welcome Back, Kotter. It made John Travolta a household name before Saturday Night Fever ever hit theaters. It gave America a catchphrase that still gets quoted on playgrounds. And it hid a surprising amount of chaos behind its warm, laugh-track glow. Today we're counting down 15 stories from behind the scenes that most fans have never heard. Stories about lawsuits, feuds, screen tests, and one very famous comedian who almost couldn't finish his own cameo. Stick around, because number one is going to explain why, by the final season, the man the show was named after barely appeared in it at all. Let's get into it. The whole show traces back to a single dinner. Gabe Kaplan was doing stand-up at the Comedy Store when a young producer named Alan Sachs introduced himself after the set. Sachs was coming off work on Chico and The Man, and was scouting for his next project. The two of them hit it off enough that Sachs called the next day, which in an industry built on empty promises to stay in touch, counted as a genuine miracle. They met for lunch to talk shop, and somewhere between ordering and the check arriving, Kaplan floated an idea. What if someone built a sitcom directly out of a stand-up act, instead of just borrowing a comedian's persona? Sachs couldn't think of a single example where that had actually been done, so they started building one on the spot, napkin style. The first version was simple: 5 guys who'd graduated high school together, but never really grown up, still acting like teenagers in their late 20s. Then came the harder question: what would hold the show together week to week? An authority figure of some kind felt necessary. So they tried a guidance counselor. That didn't quite click either. So the counselor became a teacher. And then the concept sharpened even further. What if the teacher had been exactly the same kind of underachieving screw-up as the students he was now stuck supervising? That one detail is what turned a loose premise into an actual show. Here's the strange coda to the story. The waiter serving that table apparently spent the whole meal listening in as a television series got invented over his section, and afterward he tried to claim a stake in it, arguing that his presence somehow made him a collaborator. He went so far as to pursue a legal claim for a cut of the profits. Kaplan barely dwells on the episode in his own retelling, mentioning only that when it came time to actually revise the treatment into something usable, he did it with Sachs, not with the waiter, who by that point had become, in Kaplan's words, difficult to deal with. Ask most fans who came up with the name Sweat Hogs, and you'll probably get a shrug, or a guess that it was Kaplan himself. It wasn't. Credit belongs to a jobbing television writer named Peter Meyerson, whose most notable prior work was co-writing the very first episode of The Monkees and sticking around for several more. A band. It's worth remembering. That wasn't even a real band until the show made it one. When ABC needed someone to turn Kaplan and Sachs's loose treatment into an actual, shootable pilot script, they brought in Meyerson, whose specialty was essentially organized chaos. He had about a month to deliver something usable, and what he handed back didn't just tighten the story. It gave the 4 leads a group identity that nobody had specifically asked him to invent. Kaplan has been unambiguous about this over the years. The name was entirely Meyerson's contribution, full stop. The reward for that contribution was a developed for television by credit, which sounds like a courtesy line, but functioned as a genuine ownership stake, reportedly around 5% of the show's profits. Decades later, in one of the odder footnotes in television history, Meyerson put that exact percentage up for sale through an online auction, effectively selling off his slice of a show most people don't even know he helped create. By the fall of 1978, John Travolta was arguably the biggest young star on the planet. Grease had been in theaters for a few months and was on its way to becoming the year's top-grossing film, and Robert Stigwood had already locked him into a 3-picture movie deal. And yet, contractually, Travolta was still required to show up at Buchanan High and deliver lines about rubber hoses for a reported $2,000 an episode. The problem was timing. Travolta had signed his Kotter contract back when he was an unknown stage actor, and unknown stage actor pay simply didn't match the reality of a post-Saturday Night Fever schedule. So the arrangement got restructured, not as a pay bump, but as an exit ramp. Fewer episodes per season, freeing him up for film work, along with a new on-screen credit, special guest star, which was really just a polite way of saying he'd become a part-time visitor on the show that made him famous. Accounts differ slightly on the exact episode count for that final stretch, but most settle around 8 appearances. What's not in dispute is the shape of his exit. He's front and center in the season's opening episodes, essentially gone by the midpoint, and completely absent from the back half of the run. His last appearance as Vinnie Barbarino involves the Sweat Hogs trapped in a broken hospital elevator with a woman going into labor, loud, chaotic, and capped off with Barbarino kissing a nurse. There's no farewell scene, no acknowledgement on screen that the show's biggest star was making his final appearance. He just delivers a baby, and then he's gone for good. Robert Hedges walked out of his welcome back, Kotter audition absolutely convinced he'd just won the role of Vinnie Barbarino. Nobody corrected that assumption until he actually showed up for work. As the story is usually told, Hedges stepped into an elevator alongside co-creator Alan Sachs and a stranger he'd never met, and Sachs made the introductions. Epstein, meet Barbarino. Hedges immediately corrected him. He was Barbarino. Sachs corrected him right back. He was actually cast as Epstein, and the guy standing next to him in the elevator was the real Barbarino. What Hedges did next says a lot about him. There was no argument, no storming out, no angry call to his agent. He asked exactly one question. Would Epstein get paid the same as Barbarino? Told yes. He shrugged it off and went to work. He and the man from that elevator, the actual Barbarino, stayed close for the rest of his life. Close enough that years later, when Hedges had a daughter, he asked that same actor to be her godfather. The audition room for this show attracted a genuinely strange mix of talent. Gloria Swanson, yes, that Gloria Swanson, 25 years past her legendary turn in Sunset Boulevard and 76 years old at the time, actually read for a role on this show. She was up for the school principal, a part that had originally been written as a woman before producers flipped the gender, turning it into what became Mr. Woodman. Farrah Fawcett and Kate Jackson both auditioned for the role of Julie Kotter, roughly a year before Charlie's Angels would make both of them household names. Marcia Strassman got the part instead. Meanwhile, the mother of Arnold Orhack very nearly went to Doris Roberts, years before she'd become a 5-time Emmy winner on Everybody Loves Raymond. Instead, producer James Carmack pushed for Ellen Travolta, John Travolta's real-life older sister, meaning the actress playing Horshack's mother ended up being related to the actor playing Barbarino. She'd later resurface as Fonzie's aunt on Happy Days, because it sometimes felt like the entire decade of television ran on the same dozen or so actors. But the single best artifact from this whole casting process belongs to Jonathan Frakes. Years before becoming Commander Riker on Star Trek The Next Generation, Frakes screen-tested for Boda Labar, the Southern transfer student added in the show's 4th season, black and white footage, feathered hair, swinging hard at a Southern drawl. He didn't land the part, but the tape survived. Decades later, on the set of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, director Anson Mount reportedly queued up that old screen test mid-scene and played it for the cast, framing it as an incoming transmission from Starfleet. Frakes apparently never clocked that it was a prank and thanked everyone for the tribute. Nearly every one of the Sweat Hogs was lifted, with only minor disguise, from real people in Gabe Kaplan's actual life. He'd been performing versions of these characters on stage for years as part of a bit called Holes and Mellow Rolls. Freddie Boom Boom Washington was drawn from a classmate nicknamed Freddie Ferdy Payton. Juan Epstein borrowed part of his name from a kid known around school as Epstein the Animal. Arnold Orhack required almost no invention at all. That was a real classmate's real name. And Vinnie Barbarino was actually a fusion of 2 different people, a classmate named Eddie Lurie and another named Ray Barbarino. Travolta's own audition tape from March of 1975 still has him referring to the character as Eddie Barbarino, before the 2 names were fully merged. Then there's the character who essentially didn't exist in the original pitch. Kaplan's early treatment had 5 students, including a Puerto Rican student and a Jewish student written as 2 separate characters. When ABC greenlit the pilot, network executive Michael Eisner reportedly gave one simple note: 5 characters was one too many, so combine 2 of them. Make one student both Puerto Rican and Jewish. Kaplan tells that story as settled fact. Writer Peter Meyerson has told a different version of it to the press, claiming the idea was actually his. Either way, the character who emerged, Juan Luis Pedro Felipe de Huevos Epstein, exists largely because somebody wanted a shorter cast list. He was played by Robert Hedges, a New Jersey native with a Hungarian father and an Italian mother, who reportedly built the entire performance around the mannerisms of Chico Marx. In 1978, Marcia Strassman sat down with People magazine and didn't hold back. She described being genuinely unhappy on the show, describing Kaplan's behavior toward her as unpredictable, warm one day, cold and distant the next, and said flatly that open hostility from him would have been easier to handle than the constant uncertainty. She'd grown to dislike the series so much that she openly hoped it would get canceled. Some of that frustration had nothing to do with any co-star. Her 5-year contract locked her out of other acting opportunities, and she claimed to have turned down at least 2 film roles because of it, spending roughly a year and a half quietly trying to get released from her deal. For long stretches, her character's screen time amounted to little more than asking her television husband about his day. When she returned to set after the interview ran, her castmates reportedly formed a joking, protective circle around her, suggesting she might want a bulletproof vest. Kaplan, for his part, didn't say a word to her directly until he actually read the article himself and picked up the phone. That call is apparently the real origin point of the tension between them, not the interview itself. Someone had been telling each of them, separately, that the other couldn't stand them, none of which was true. Kaplan says he'd actually been pushing behind the scenes for more balance between classroom scenes and home scenes, which would have meant more screen time for Strassman's character, the opposite of what she believed. Whatever the miscommunication, the fallout was real. The two didn't speak again for roughly 15 years, until their children ended up at the same school and Kaplan heard a familiar voice call out his name across the schoolyard. Kaplan never heard this one firsthand. It came back to him secondhand from Alan Sachs after a meeting with James Carmack. According to that account, Carmack's first reaction to the Kotter concept was that it might be the worst show idea he'd ever encountered. Not long after saying that, Carmack signed on as executive producer anyway, directed the pilot himself, and ran the show for 4 years. Enthusiasm, apparently, can show up late. Carmack wasn't some detached network suit, either. He was an actor and producer with hits already behind him, which made his early objection stranger, not more understandable. At an initial meeting at his home, he reportedly spent much of the conversation arguing that the show's ethnically mixed cast would be a distraction, comparing it unfavorably to our gang, and insisting nobody would care about it. Days later, in a private conversation, he escalated the claim, suggesting the network itself didn't want that kind of diversity on screen, a claim that made little sense, since ABC had already ordered the pilot and Eisner's own note had personally shaped the multicultural Epstein character. Kaplan says he never figured out who Carmack was supposedly quoting. Carmack also briefly pushed to have Kaplan replaced as the lead, on a show built directly out of Kaplan's own adolescence, and came down hard on Travolta during pilot production, hard enough that Travolta was still bringing it up decades later, still unsure exactly what he'd done to provoke it. Once the show became a hit, most of that friction faded, with one notable exception. Carmack repeatedly argued that Barbarino's catchphrase, "I'm so confused," made the character look weak and should be cut. It stayed in for all 4 seasons anyway. While most of the country got a light-hearted new sitcom in September of 1975, Boston got nothing. The city's ABC affiliate WCB-TV simply kept Welcome Back, cut her off its schedule entirely. Boston was in the middle of an intense, court-ordered school desegregation battle at the time, and station leadership apparently decided a primetime comedy, centered on a cheerfully integrated Brooklyn classroom, was the last thing local viewers needed that fall. The official public reasoning offered was different and honestly stranger. Reports at the time cited concerns that a cast of underachieving high schoolers might set a bad example for local kids. A station spokesperson insisted the show wasn't offensive in any way, while still confirming it wouldn't be airing, a position that didn't hold together well under scrutiny. Kaplan called the whole thing an unjustified form of censorship, saying there was nothing genuinely controversial in the show at all. Carmack, who'd once called the concept the worst idea he'd ever heard, took a lighter view, joking that getting banned in Boston was funnier than anything actually airing that season, while also claiming not to understand why it had happened. The ban didn't last. Once the show became a genuine national hit, WCB quietly folded it back into the schedule, with most accounts placing that reversal around the 5th episode, roughly a month after the season began. Cast member Lawrence Hilton Jacobs later put the deeper point simply: the show was never explicitly arguing for integration. It just showed a mixed classroom on screen and treated it as completely unremarkable, which, in the context of 1975, was itself a kind of statement. James Buchanan High School isn't a real place, but the building used for its exterior shots throughout the show's run absolutely is. New Utrecht High School in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, which happens to be Gabe Kaplan's actual alma mater. That same building also produced David Geffen, comedian Buddy Hackett, Scott Baio, and 2/3 of the Three Stooges, in the form of Moe and Curly Howard. Kaplan's own time there wasn't especially decorated. He's described how New York schools in the 1950s sorted students into 5 track classes per grade, ranked by presumed intelligence, and he was consistently placed in the 4th tier, joking, in his own retelling, that the 4th tier held the dumbest kids specifically because the 5th tier was reserved for the ones already headed toward real trouble. He was also, less famously, a genuine star on the school's baseball team, with real hopes of turning that into a professional career. Those hopes ended at a San Francisco Giants spring training tryout, where he failed to impress anyone. He returned east and took a job as a bellman at a resort hotel in Lakewood, New Jersey, where he spent months watching the comedians who performed there and eventually decided he could do the same thing himself. More than a decade of stand-up followed before Alan Sachs ever approached him at the Comedy Store. Underneath all of it, Kaplan has pointed to a single influence as the emotional core of the entire show. One remedial track teacher at New Utrecht, who was the only adult who seemed to believe he'd amount to anything. That teacher never appeared on screen, was never credited in any way, and, after 50 years of this story being retold, has apparently never had her name printed anywhere. By the time Kotter's casting director Lynn Stallmaster set his sights on a mostly unknown stage actor named John Travolta for the role of Barbarino, finding him wasn't the hard part, keeping him available was. Travolta had a Broadway offer on the table with rehearsals about to begin, and given that he needed the money, he was fully prepared to take it and skipped the audition process altogether. So Stallmaster got creative. He arranged for Travolta to take a small role in a low-budget 1975 horror film, not as a career move, but simply as a paycheck substantial enough to bridge the gap until Kotter casting got underway. It worked. Travolta stuck around, auditioned, and landed the part. The final obstacle wasn't a scheduling conflict at all. It was his own mother. Helen Travolta was herself an acting teacher, and she'd watched enough young performers get permanently typecast by an early role to be wary. Her concern was that audiences would start assuming her son actually talked and thought the way Barbarino did, and her broader argument was that nobody had ever become a genuine star by playing a dumb kid from Brooklyn. Travolta took the role anyway, and within about a year he'd become a certified teen idol, proving his mother's specific worry wrong, even if her instinct that the role would define him publicly turned out to be at least partly right. Kaplan worked a Groucho Marx impression into nearly every episode of the series. It became something audiences genuinely came to expect. So for the second season, the writers built an episode around the ultimate payoff. Kotter does his usual Groucho bit, and then the real Groucho Marx walks into the classroom to react to it in person. The episode was titled Sadie Hawkins Day. That scene never actually got shot. According to Mark Evanier, a story editor who has written about the incident, the booking only came together in the first place because Groucho's longtime companion and manager, Erin Fleming, wanted a guest appearance of her own worked into a future episode as part of the arrangement. By this point, Groucho was 86 years old and needed help simply getting onto the set. Members of the studio audience, expecting classic grease paint and eyebrow showmanship, reportedly didn't even recognize him. He couldn't reliably deliver dialogue anymore, so the planned speaking role was quietly downgraded to a silent walk-on, and even that was eventually scrapped entirely. What actually happened instead was a quiet photo session. Groucho seated in Kotter's classroom chair, posing with the cast, Travolta included. Those photographs have reportedly never been publicly released, described by people who saw them as simply too difficult to look at, given how frail he appeared. Several cast and crew members are said to have been visibly emotional. Robert Hedges reportedly took it hardest of anyone, having built his entire portrayal of Epstein around Chico Marx, Groucho's own brother, and admitted he didn't know how he'd managed to perform that impression again after seeing him in person. Groucho died a few months later, in August of 1977. The show's theme song became a hit almost by accident, born out of a songwriting problem that never fully got solved. The working title for the whole project was originally just Kotter, and producer Alan Sachs wanted a loose, folk-influenced theme in the style of his favorite band, The Lovin' Spoonful. It turned out his agent also represented that band's former frontman, John Sebastian, and one phone call later, Sebastian had the assignment and immediately ran into a wall. By his own account, the only usable word he could find that rhymed with Kotter was otter, and understandably, he wasn't interested in building a chorus around a sea mammal. So he dropped the surname from the song entirely and wrote instead about the underlying premise: someone returning to the neighborhood he once thought he'd escaped for good. Producers liked the result enough that they renamed the entire series after the song before a single episode had aired. Then the song outperformed the show that inspired it. Welcome Back hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, topped the adult contemporary chart, and somehow even landed on the country chart at number 93, an unusually wide chart spread for a television-themed song. And its story didn't end there. In 2004, rapper Maze, returning from a 5-year break from music during which he'd focused on preaching, built his comeback single almost entirely around Sebastian's original hook, keeping the same title and melody while giving it an overtly religious message. That single went gold, peaked at number 32 on the Hot 100, and reached number 8 on the rap charts. Its music video is its own strange artifact, a near shot-for-shot parody of the opening of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, with Maze in a red cardigan welcoming viewers into his own version of the neighborhood. Sebastian's song ended up charting twice, 28 years apart, both times carried by the same idea: someone announcing they'd come back to a place they once swore they'd left. He never did find a rhyme for Kotter. He just never needed one. TV Guide once ranked "Up Your Nose with a Rubber Hose" among the greatest catchphrases in television history, placing it at number 15 on their list. It's a completely harmless line, and kids repeated it on playgrounds for the better part of a decade. What most of those kids never knew is that it's a cleaned-up version of something considerably cruder: the real-life Arnold Orhack, an actual Brooklyn classmate of Kaplan's, whose real name went straight into the show unchanged, apparently had a go-to insult built around Mellow Rolls, a rolled ice cream treat sold widely around New York in the 1950s. According to Kaplan, the original line was something closer to "up your hole with a mellow roll." Network Standards executives reviewed it and got to work sanding it down. They kept the rhythm and the sing-song delivery, but swapped out everything that would have generated complaint calls, landing on "rubber hose" as the replacement. There's a twist buried